Welcome back to What's Up with Jessup. We were just talking and finishing up the previous episode. Now we're back.
We're back.
We're back. We're here with Smitha. You are studying philosophy at Johns Hopkins University, rising senior, you said. Is that right?
That is correct.
That's very cool. So we were talking about so many philosophical implications as well as political implications of the coronavirus there in Baltimore City and the county. So first things first, I'll ask questions. What's the difference? Explain to us, people who may not live in Baltimore, the difference between the county and the city.
So to emphasize and clarify, I'm currently residing right now in my parents' home in Perry Hall, Maryland. Shout out to Perry Hall Gators.
Yeah.
Chomp chomp. Gators, but chomp chomp chomp.
Okay.
But my other home, which is a growing home in my life and that I do miss dearly, I especially miss the sunsets in Baltimore, Baltimore City. So Perry Hall, Maryland is a suburban town in Baltimore County. Baltimore City is an urban development. It's an urban city. Has a huge amount of history and culture and traditions.
Whoa.
And county versus city. So that's a good question. County versus city you could talk a lot about different things, about the development, about the history, about the economics and stuff.
Let me ask you about race. Let's get into the spicy.
What do you exactly want to know about the difference between Baltimore City versus Baltimore County?
So let's talk about race and income level. You said I know the spiciest stuff. You said the county is a suburban area. Does that mean they're mostly white and rich people? What is that?
So, in regard to the history of Baltimore City, Baltimore City used to be, if you look up the history of Baltimore City, I encourage everybody to look it up. It's a very interesting history, and it has a lot of implications on how Baltimore City functions today. Baltimore City was a largely industrial place years ago, pumping, making factory work, and had a huge shipping yard. A bunch of people were living in Baltimore City, largely to be working in the shipping industries and the factory industries. And of course, over time, with the sprinkle of
and Bethlehem Steel
and the steel industry, and then over time, Baltimore City had a fluctuation of population changes, also with growing other factors such as like racism and prejudice. This impacted what we call the white flight, where majority of Caucasian populations moved up into the suburban area, having flexibility to have more lawn space, garage, more flexibility to be able to take highways that were very convenient for them from the county to come into the city for work. Of course, not everybody had that type of financial flexibility or opportunity. Largely marginalized and colored populations marginalized and populations of color did not have such opportunities. And so,
what's wrong with colored populations?
I think that the colored population is kind of outdated. I think that's kind of a harsh statement. As a brown woman myself, I feel a little embarrassed saying it like that. I don't know. People might not be bothered, but
but I think the now trend is people of color. You're saying?
Yes, people of color is more appropriate and far more kinder to say instead. Anyways, so population dynamics wise, not that I have not been seriously analyzing Baltimore income levels or economic development anytime.
This takes a PhD to be really able to analyze it.
But give me a moment, Jessup. Let me just confirm what I'm about to say by
fact checking on
Wikipedia. Let me just do this.
But you're right. You're probably right. There was a lot of redlining happening, as you said. There was a lot of white people who were rich going out to these suburban areas.
And those are like two very prominent things. It could also be other things like how the response and dynamic between the city and the county administration, and then the larger government at large. And then there's other things about where's the access to food, where's access to food, where are the grocery stores, how does that impact people's access to healthy and affordable foods. Baltimore City has a larger prominent presence of corner stores, and corner stores have a different availability of foods that are not as the same or affordable or it's not as the same as grocery stores. And then there's all these other factors, like you said, redlining, transportation access, job access, housing access, whether the prices go up or down. And so looking at Baltimore County, Maryland, datausa.io, median household income level in Baltimore County is 76,182.
Uh-huh.
Poverty rate of 9.1%.
Uh-huh.
And let's see now. Population's on a very, very, very slow decline.
Uh-huh.
Let me see. I want to look up
This
Baltimore
is
City now.
all good statistics. Okay.
Hey, this is from brought to you by no, not officially sponsored, but I looked it up on datausa.org.io. Baltimore
Okay. Sounds
City.
good. Yeah. And while you're looking that up, I will give you more statistics. The cities with the highest Black or African American population, Baltimore is like the fifth
Yeah,
largest. And so
it
65%
is.
of the people are Black.
Yes. And to add to those statistics, Baltimore
Yeah.
City has a lower medium income of 51,000, and the
Uh-huh.
poverty rate is about 22.4%. So there's some numbers to show to you.
Yeah.
And
Tell
yes,
me now.
there is a
Uh-huh.
large African American population in Baltimore City, equally growing diverse immigration population that's going on too. It's something
Yeah.
that I will be personally exploring in my upcoming senior fellowship of
Oh,
looking at the
okay.
dynamics of immigration and healthcare in Baltimore City.
Yeah.
Can't wait to return another time to talk about
Yeah.
that work, what I
I
learned. So
know.
yeah,
That's the
that would be
Baltimore
very
Core one, right? Or what was it?
yes. So I am very honored for the opportunity to be a fellow for the France Merrick Civic Fellowship under the Center for Social Concern at Johns Hopkins University. Woot woot woot.
Cool. Wow.
I will be in a very intimate personal cohort of some other people, and we will all be focusing on various focus areas that require us to be working with nonprofits or working with the private sector or government sector, and looking at these focus areas and how these different sectors interact with one another, and ideally, hopefully, establish and implement a senior year project by the end of the year. Yes.
Wow, that sounds very good. So now back to the topic of the coronavirus in Baltimore City. You explained to us what the difference is between Baltimore County and Baltimore City, and now you were
Yes.
saying there are differing responses for the coronavirus as well.
So Baltimore County and Baltimore City have officially put out a statement where they are pretty well coordinated. The county
Uh-huh.
executive, Johnny O, wants to
Uh-huh.
coordinate pretty well with Baltimore City. That doesn't necessarily mean other counties have been collaborating in this efforts. There are some counties in Maryland that has not been partially open. They've been fully opened.
Hmm.
And this announcement has been pretty recent, I think, in the past week. So
Yeah.
it'll be very interesting to see in the next 2 weeks what happens on cases uh, and the outbreaks and how that's be controllable. And hopefully our numbers can keep going down and not anybody else be hurt or harmed. Yeah.
Right, right, right. So now we're going to go back to the political affiliations of the protests. I mean, so you are saying, I mean, we've seen that Baltimore is less willing to ease the measures of the coronavirus
Mhm.
outbreak, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't have to say it, but I will say it. Other states like maybe Florida or other states in the South that I will not.
I think Michigan had
Yeah.
uh, as well as had some protests going on, I think.
Yes. Protests. Yeah. I think maybe Trump was talking about Virginia for some reason. Several states are less willing to do that and are talking up more. You know, Detroit. It's because there's a lot of manufacturing plants, and so
Yeah.
all those plants are shut down, and then these people are out of jobs, and some people also want haircuts. So,
Yeah. Oh, like, definitely. I'm very comfortable to talk about this. I've been
yeah.
reflecting over this a lot. And yes, it has been pretty apparent from the pictures and the articles that largely Caucasian populations that are very much affiliated to very, very extreme conservative ideology and also are largely supporters of Trump have been very adamant and open and expressive of wanting to open up. And there are good reasons. There are good reasons behind that. As you mentioned, people are out of jobs. Our unemployment rate is spiking. I believe as of this moment,
Mhm.
unemployment rate at the United States,
Since 1910s at least.
yeah, it has been up and it's been going up. And it I think it is worse than 2008 and worse than other situations in the United States. And it's understandable because even if unemployment is going up, it's not necessarily meaning that every individual is getting fair, affordable, equitable access to unemployment insurance or stimulus checks or other types of safety nets that can help someone through during this time. And
Mhm.
even without that, there's even the question of like other things, like education as a whole is a very interesting situation during a closure, and how people have access to a really strong connection to internet and doing classes online, which might be maybe easier for college students but definitely harder for children. And some people have really good internet connection to it, some people don't, and that already puts them behind. So there's the jobs, there's the education pressure, there's also that larger idea of well-being. And it is not a joke, it is not a lie, that the pandemic can have quite a toll on people's mental health. I know myself, it has quite a toll on my mental health. It is quite a journey to find opportunities. I am pretty privileged and fortunate to have the opportunities to really focus on self-care. But if an
Mhm.
individual is unemployed and is looking for food on the table and is having a child that is struggling through education, and that could all compile together, have a really, really negative impact on their mental health. I could totally understand people's frustrations of
Uh-huh.
wanting to open things up and get things done and get our society rolling the ball forward. Now,
Right.
when you mentioned this thing about haircuts,
Uh-huh.
that itself is like a very interesting phenomenon. That's like the idea of people wanting the wanting haircuts open and nail salons open,
Uh-huh.
and that
Massage
itself is an interesting
parlors.
phenomenon
Yeah.
because in one sense there are people who do work in those industries that actually do want their businesses to open up because that is their family business, that's their bread and butter. But then there's people who don't necessarily work at those industries and those businesses but want somebody else to open up their business to give
Mhm.
them a haircut or give them do nail salon treatment. And I was reading this reflective piece from one of my friends. I will not put their name out here if they don't want to, but it
Uh-huh.
was very interesting because they did talk about something that made me reflect a lot, and it was just how the need to open up certain things that actually is is like quite a kind of a reflection of classism in that extent that you want services to be opened up for yourself, but it's not necessarily something that's going to be very safe and viable for the business in itself. And
Uh-huh.
yet to want to have that open up for your own convenience does come from a place of classism and does come
Right.
from a place of a power dynamic and can be, in simple terms, insensitive. But
Right.
yeah, it's
So,
just so interesting to look at the two sides of this issue.
of course, of course. And now I'm going to be pushing boundaries even further,
Go for it.
making people uncomfortable. So now it's interesting, right? I said it making fun of it, right? Being like, oh, getting a haircut, that's absurd. And it sounds like it. But it's also interesting to see because I'm here in South Korea. All the
Yes.
nail salons and haircut
No,
places
open.
are actually open here. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I mean, South Korea, I've heard, has been doing a fantastic job in response and control and public
Yeah.
health measures in
Right.
contrast.
Exactly. So it's interesting in saying, what are the assumptions that we're having in saying, are actually hair salons dangerous? Are massage parlors dangerous? And can people still be safe while getting their haircuts and businesses being open? So that's like an interesting topic to think about. Where if you do patient tracing, like contact tracing, and you
Yes.
have enough testing, maybe you can do something like South Korea, where the economy has not taken any impact, most like very small impact, right? There are the number of patients is reduced, and everyone's really outside, and still business as usual. So
Wait, tell me more about the steps that also, I don't know if you heard, but Maryland Governor Hogan and his wife, like they had a huge part of the collaboration of getting those masks and equipment from South Korea. So that was
yeah,
like pretty cool to hear about as a Marylander.
exactly.
I'm like, ooh, go Maryland. But yes, tell me more about what South Korea has been doing and the steps they have taken.
Exactly. We've heard about the 500,000 testing kits that Maryland got from South Korea through a memorandum of understanding. And so it's interesting because, this just everything about what's happening in the US is just unimaginable from this perspective. Because, first of all, I mean, the US is a country with the best supply lines, best like level and quality, at least, of healthcare, right? Uh, and yet, the United States is lacking 75-cent masks.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Mhm.
And yet, the very first second I stepped into South Korea, I got the contact tracing. I have an app on my phone that constantly traces where I am just to make sure I'm doing my self quarantine. And then within 2 days of arriving, I get 5 masks, two hand sanitizers, and one full bottle of sanitizer to sanitize my entire place, and
Yeah.
like biohazard, bags and things like that. Just a lot of measures that are just completely unimaginable from the U.S.
Mhm.
perspective. So,
Yeah. Wow. I'm curious. What is I'm curious. I
uh,
always wondered this question about, I guess part of me is quite curious about, like, was US population so large that it couldn't handle this? And maybe you might correct me, like, no,
maybe.
South Korea's population handle it. You guys could handle it. Or could it also be part about the shock that the US had due to their late response and then the overwhelming nature of that shock? But
Mhm.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the US knew about this for a long time. I mean, even I
Yeah.
knew. I mean, any kind of health professional who's working in this area already heard that the coronavirus was happening. You can listen to our podcast episode back in like December, talking about like, this is happening in China. And we had like correspondents in China saying like, hey, guys, things are going pretty crazy up in here. And so we already knew about this. And this is also not a new phenomenon. I don't understand. Like,
Not your hands. This is not a new
new
phenomenon.
phenomenon. Yeah, we've had coronaviruses in the past, SARS, MERS. We have far deadlier actually diseases. MERS is about 4 to 5 times more deadly, fatal than
Wow.
than the new novel COVID-19 that we're experiencing right now.
Mhm.
So, South Korea, China have had a lot of experience in responding to these viruses, and it's just asking the question of would it have been possible that the U.S. Responded more effectively while not jeopardizing its entire economy? It's just a question.
Yes. Very good question. I'm sure I'm very curious to see about people doing economic models or simulations over this and seeing like if this could have been prevented of such a detrimental impact upon our economy and then the job outlook of itself.
Right, right. Now another question. This
Mm.
is also provocative and maybe pushing boundaries. Is uh so I'll start with the provocative question. Why aren't Black people slash African American people protesting these Baltimore policies of not easing these coronavirus measures? I'll
It's a
yeah.
good question. It's a good question.
It is
Um,
a question. I'll try to justify why. So, this is my reasoning of understanding this. So, a lot of people in Detroit, Michigan, and people who are protesting these tend to be white people, but they also are of lower income. So, like
yes.
people who have actually lost their jobs from manufacturing companies and things like that. Income wise, if you only look at income wise, a lot of people in Baltimore County, not county, maybe city then. Yeah,
Yeah.
Baltimore City tend to be lower income. They work at companies that are have to like they are either temporary workers or have lower income, are not salaried, and therefore when these coronavirus measures are taken in place, they are more vulnerable
And
economically.
possibly laid off. Yes.
Right, laid off,
Yeah.
exactly. So they completely lose their source of income. Why aren't they protesting?
So that is a very interesting. Um, Let me think for a second. I think that, so I will rephrase. I am
Yeah.
South Asian. So it is not like I can speak for the Black African American population of America. Cannot. However, I do think that something that is very, very, very evident is that there's a definite amount of privilege, white privilege, involved in
Mhm.
uh, these anti-stay-at-home order protests,
Right.
and you definitely can see that response. Like if you're
Uh-huh.
someone who's completely ignorant to white privilege, well,
Uh-huh.
let me tell you, folks, go on social media, go
Uh-huh.
look at the responses, and you will see, because it is clear that these protests are largely staged by Caucasian populations, and
You're right.
majority of them are wearing and holding guns. but they are not being
Wait,
violently
people actually hold guns during protests?
actually holding guns. Like, they're actually holding guns.
That's funny.
Yeah, they're holding their guns. They're going inside of
Right.
government buildings, and they're going in there, and they're protesting in there, and they are holding their gun as they protest. Sometimes they get in the face of nurses, and sometimes they
Right.
get right in the face of police officers, which
Right.
itself is such a very interesting photo of largely Caucasian protesters that are protesting against the stay-at-home order, that are yelling in the faces of police officers.
Yeah.
And there, right there,
Yeah.
folks, if you look this up on social media, that should definitely be a picture to you of white privilege, because they are not being violently arrested. They're not being hosed down violently. They're not being shot at. I really hope that I don't agree that anybody should be shot at. Okay, I'm to be with that.
Yeah.
But in comparison, there has been comments, and it's true. If there was a person of color, African American, Latinx, Native people that were protesting,
Yeah.
Against a stay-at-home order, then oh my God, there would have been a whole like violence, and it would have been awful. It would have been brutal. And even like in the example of Native tribes protesting against pipelines, which are damaging their lands, interfering with their lifestyle.
Yeah.
In that picture, they're being arrested, they're being harmed, they're being excessively hurt. And or in another picture of African Americans being extremely upset of the police brutality going on in the United States, and those peaceful protests being exacerbated in the news, and being their experiences and their grief being invalidated, or even being exaggerated to such a, or being intensified to such a point that they're getting arrested for that. And
Sure.
I think that's why, in my
Point
personal
taken.
reflection, I think that's why that you don't hear about and you don't see much about people of color, largely marginalized populations, protesting against these stay-at-home orders. Because one, for first and foremost, safety. Because it is not safe to do it. There's not necessarily a foolproof social distancing method. Two, a huge concern of increasing racial tensions and increasing tensions between a marginalized populations versus a power dynamic with the police. And if you mix those tensions together, then it can create a situation that could be that could put the marginalized population in a very vulnerable situation, whether it be like verbal violence or actual violence of itself. And three, this just showed when the whole like case came out about Ahmaud, the black runner who was shot by two white people. And I don't know if you've seen the video. I will warn you, it is very, very sad to watch. I would warn of a trigger warning. But this case happened months ago. And only when that footage was released to the public,
it went viral, right?
It became viral and it became news. And that is so frustrating that that had to happen, that it had to happen like that, that you couldn't just rely on what we call justice being blind, and yet justice couldn't be blind, and yet the regular people had to say something. And yet with the video out, people still are very, very skeptical of it, which is very disheartening to hear about. And the reason why I bring up that example is to bring up the point 3, which is the concern that people of color protesting for these things, in any of these situations where people of color, marginalized people are protesting for something, it will invite skepticism, and it would invalidate their experience, and it will invalidate what they do, and it will invalidate the mission of itself, which is these type of things, these type of nuances involved when marginalized populations are protesting is not necessarily evident in what's going on when a largely Caucasian population is protesting against the stay-at-home orders, which is a demonstration of white privilege.
All right, point taken. Now I will ask even more provocative questions. 2 questions. I know. You've already experienced this in your classes, Smitha, but this is pretty much what we do in like philosophy classes. You push boundaries, you think about things, and you go to the essence, the root of why things happen, and say, is this true? Regardless of maybe the political and philosophical implications. So my question is now, easing up, like, so this person was shot while running, which is just preposterous. No one would really agree that this was a good result, right?
Absolutely not.
But now, why would people not protest the measures? Because easing these stay-at-home orders would actually allow police not to sanction people and not to enforce these measures and being like, oh, you're outside, we're gonna kill you. Like,
No, wait, I think there's a
uh-huh.
misinformation about the situation with Ahmad.
Okay.
That was not police officers. Those were
Okay. Who
regular.
was it?
It was regular citizens.
Oh,
And
regular citizen just shot Ahmad.
yes, let me just do a quick Google search to get the proper vocabulary.
Okay.
But Ahmad
Yeah.
case.
Fair enough. So here's the thing. I mean, the point remains because there's a general fear of marginal populations, as you phrased it, for the police, right? And there are, fears that the regular population might be attacking people of color just because they are running outside. So my question would be, if we actually ease these measures of stay-at-home orders, wouldn't other people be less likely to shoot people?
So
What do you
actually,
think?
give me 1 second. I'm just reading something really quickly.
It's okay. So like that's just one thing to think about. Like, if you ease these measures that say, you should stay at home, it's rather, you can be outside, just maintain the social distancing, maybe people might be less scared of being shot by the police
I'm
or
gonna
regular white
ask
people.
you to repeat that question one more time because I had some audio interference with the video here. Can you ask your question one more time? I had to mute you for a second because I had to do something. But can you repeat that
No
one more
worries.
time?
So when these stay-at-home orders are eased, wouldn't people of color be less fearful that they will be shot by either the police or white people? Or,
Okay. In the situation of Ahmad, though,
huh?
I the situation that happened is Ahmaud Arbery, 25. I'm quoting CNN to like tell you very clearly. He was jogging in his neighborhood, in
Uh-huh.
his own neighborhood,
Uh-huh.
when a father and a son, a white
Yeah.
father and white son,
Uh-huh.
they were, and I saw this video. It was so disheartening. They were like standing on top of their pickup trucks. They had their long long rifles,
Right.
and
I mean, Smitha, I understand. I understand. This is a very tragic event, right?
yeah,
This is a
but
tragic
wait, let me
event.
just, these are citizens, and they thought that Arbery looked like a person suspected of a recent break-in in the area. And so,
Okay.
but the
So this
thing is,
wasn't even related to coronavirus, or what's
no,
happening?
this is just a black man running. And
Oh,
that's the point. The thing is, coronavirus or not, a black man was shot just because he was running. And likewise, in so many other situations, a black man or woman is shot just for being black. And I don't think that these coronavirus like safety measures have anything to do with what's blatantly present in this case and a lot of these cases, which is the consistent racism, the consistent systematic racism, the structural discrimination, and the consistent like violence against African Americans and
right.
likewise other people of color.
Right. I mean, studying in Baltimore City, I mean, we are at the heart of that, and I understand.
Yes. Freddie Gray, it's been a couple years now, and oh my God, yes, there was the whole billboard that got changed too, but yes, never
Right.
forget Freddie Gray. Yeah.
Right. But the question still remains, right? So wouldn't, forget about like people just being shot like for no reason. Like that happens all the time. It's a problem. We have to fix it. But like
Definitely going up.
coronavirus specifically.
I just want to say this is definitely going up as a case for hate crime. This is like
Right.
this.
I mean, I agree with you. I agree
Yeah,
with you.
yeah.
So like, right, this should be done, but that is an issue for another time, for another episode, maybe.
I will do a
Yeah.
little bit of homework to make sure I get all my factors. I'd
Sure,
be so
sure.
excited.
We'll get back to it. We'll get back to it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
here's the thing. We're back at the coronavirus
Yes.
epidemic and pandemic. And in saying this, this is an example of the fear that people have, people of color, who think either the police or white people with guns will shoot them.
Yeah, yeah.
And therefore, my reasoning is, why don't people want this measure to be eased?
Good
And
question.
you're saying because people are marginalized, there's racism, and there's because of the health, is
So
what
yeah,
you're
so
thinking.
you bring up a very good question. Coronavirus also has revealed an increase of violence and harassment to Asian American populations, especially East Asian populations, because
Right.
of the circulating, very ill-informed, absolutely false, like prejudicial tones about the origins of the virus and just blaming ethnic groups. And I know that some of my Asian
So,
American friends have
yeah.
not stepped out of their house. They haven't. They haven't ever since the beginning of this has started, particularly because their parents are very concerned
Mm,
of their son or daughter
correct.
being bothered, harassed, chased, or hurt in public.
So do you think
For
easing of these measures, stay-at-home measures, will either benefit or not benefit them? Because like they're fearful. When
yeah,
people are more outside, do you think that would be less harmful? Like people will be less attacked because they're now
I,
allowed to be outside? What do you think?
I don't think prejudice and discrimination will escape just because a large dominant group, a largely culturally dominant group is telling them to hide or telling them to
Right.
sit inside.
So
Even
you're
if this
saying even
wait,
if
wait,
the coronavirus ends, like
even
people would
yeah,
be
even when
still,
the coronavirus ends,
yeah,
we have a lot of conversations to still continue, which is how are we ensuring that Asian Americans are feeling safe? How are we ensuring that other like Native Americans feel safe? How are we ensuring that uh, Latinx populations and African Americans are feeling safe? Because once these stay-at-home orders are lifted,
mhm,
my greatest fear is that someone would taunt a marginalized person and
right,
make them feel scared to come outside, taunt them and chase them back inside, or taunt them and blame them and do unnecessary, very violently proning finger
yeah,
pointing and finger
yeah,
blaming.
yeah,
And yeah, so I think, and as this month, May is Asian American Heritage Month, um, I would want to share that I'm working with my friend Kadai and a couple of wonderful other people on
mhm,
a video project about the response that the idea that Asian Pacific Islanders, AC Americans, the PETA, the
mhm,
whole the Asian gang, who that we need to have this conversation about Asian Americans. We need to face the facts
uh-huh,
that the coronavirus has been hurting and has been harming and jeopardizing and taunting our brothers and sisters
uh-huh,
far and wide, left and right. And we need to break these misconceptions. We need to talk about the stories that people, and that's what this video is about, getting the stories of people who have experienced this discrimination and getting the stories of people who have overcome these challenges. And
right,
we are hoping the summer to release this type of project so that we can create a large message that is definitely needed about this virus is not an excuse for racism or discrimination or prejudice. And this racism and prejudice and discrimination and violence towards marginalized populations was there before the
uh-huh,
pandemic. It has
yeah,
been extremely exacerbated during the pandemic, and it will
uh-huh,
be here afterwards. And we need to tell ourselves, how much longer are we going to let it be here
yeah.
after this pandemic?
Sure. So now talking about privilege and racism and things like that. I mean, I'm going to ask you the second provocative question. Ready?
Sure, sure. Okay, let's see if I can do
I'm
it.
going to try to flip the liberal agenda on its own head and say, question its own agenda. Ready? So, you've probably heard about intersectionality, where the person who's arguing an argument
Mhm.
also exists in society, and so you could be an oppressed, woman, but you can also be a white woman, and so you are
Yeah,
both oppressed and a white, maybe privileged person at the same time. And so people who are arguing for, stay-at-home measures, I am starting to analyze that also from a dual perspective, where correct, we need health, we need people to be safe at home, right?
I think
Right.
yes, you're absolutely right. There is a
Uh-huh.
certain amount of economic advantage and
Uh-huh.
privilege and ability to be able to be staying at home
You're
and
right.
staying happy.
See,
Okay.
I didn't even ask the question, you already knew
I
where we were
knew
going.
I knew
Yeah.
exactly what you meant because you're right. And we could take this to the broader picture, right?
Uh-huh.
Celebrities out in social media and celebrities saying stay at home. They're
Yeah,
saying stay at home as they're behind their $1 million mansion and
exactly.
their so many cars and et cetera, right? Then we
Yeah.
bring the picture a little bit closer. Let's talk
Uh-huh.
about me. I am very fortunate and very privileged that I still have my family working and being able to earn an income right now. I'm very
Right.
fortunate and privileged that I have a roof over my head and that food is not of question. Like I don't have to worry about when the next meal is coming.
Right.
And I'm also very fortunate and privileged to have a strong internet connection, which does huge for my continuing education online. But that
Mhm.
is not necessarily the same. That is not necessarily the same for my next door neighbors or even for a couple of my friends in the area
Mhm.
that are questioning when is the next meal coming, that are questioning how much longer should I be working at this fast food industry, which is my only way of paycheck, but clearly is not necessarily a safe place to work because it is increasing my exposure to COVID-19.
Right.
Or the question of how am I going to ensure that my child could get their education through the critical period of K through 12, and yet it is such an expensive bill to keep up with, and I am still waiting for my unemployment benefits or my stimulus check, et cetera, et cetera. So you do bring up a really valid point about stay at home and being able to like literally like the word uh, putting with a grain of salt, thrive in a low sense, in a low key sense, thrive in a stay at home. And that's where, as a philosopher question, like, oh, here's a picture for you. You see on social media, and
Uh-huh.
I when you look at social media, I use a lot for a large reflections. There are people who are saying two different things. I am so upset that my I am so upset that people are getting unemployment checks that are much more than the money they make at work. That's not okay. And
Mhm.
when you look at that picture, it's very easy to get frustrated, but then you got to ask yourself some questions. Why in the first place were they not being paid a livable wage? Why also are we necessarily assuming that someone that's unemployed is like thriving off of this surplus money? They probably need that money because they're probably barely making it and barely living through it. And that reveals a structural issue, an issue of a systematic structure involved in how are people maintaining their well-being and health. And when we look at about the stay at home, I don't think it's okay that I and a few other people have a very fortunate, privileged opportunity to like be okay in a stay at home. I think every single person deserves to be okay and be fine, to not have to worry about the food that's coming or where their money is coming. And when you look at the response in the United States about safety nets compared to other countries, the questions of the status of safety nets in the form of healthcare, mental health care, unemployment benefits, Medicare, these safety nets are not as strong as compared to other countries' responses in these safety nets. And instead of blaming the or like judging the unemployed individual for making more money when they're unemployed than having a job, we should be saying this shouldn't be happening in the first place. Nobody should be scrapping this fast or this low to be wanting to have a pretty decent, livable, adequate life and a pretty adequate well-being of a life. And that makes me wonder, if there's a privilege to stay at home, how do we remove that privilege, right? Like, how do we create this to be an equitable situation for everyone? Not just an equal, because an equal goes like this. Equitable is everyone's being raised to that same bare minimum. So then we have to ask the question of how do we make stay at home equitable for everyone? And that's about what are the state and local and federal responses to broadband internet connection, the state, local, and federal responses to food security
Right.
or
Right. So
job insurance. And
So I will stop you there because there is an assumption, right? I mean,
yeah,
so there are two ways of looking at this, right? I mean, I agree with what you said so far, and there's privilege, and so you're saying, how do you make this equitable? How do we make
yeah,
this equitable? How do we make a social net so that people with less privilege can also survive in this stay-at-home order? But that's the assumption that we have to have a stay-at-home order, right?
mm,
The other point, other solution is that
oh,
we ease, right,
mm,
stay-at-home orders, and that this is not as necessary. And so, like, it's interesting because that is the assumption under which you would pursue more stimulus checks and things like that. And a lot of economists are saying, maybe stimulus checks, like just handing out money and printing money, isn't the solution to everything. Like, you can't
no,
solve
I'm
everything
get
with
so
checks.
excited about this. Oh my
Uh-huh.
God, Jeff. Oh, this is
Yes,
gonna be
go
such
ahead.
a good conversation. Okay, so yeah, I made an assumption that we need a stay-at-home order,
Which is not
and
your fault. It's just
no,
what
but
people
I
are
am going
saying. Yeah.
to justify that assumption and say that
Okay.
in the county that I am, and in plenty of
Uh-huh.
regions the United States, they have not necessarily have full maximum capacity to provide adequate
Uh-huh.
testing or protective equipment, and we're
Right.
not necessarily ready. Like
For the yeah.
Maryland itself has like several phases planned. Like we were just thinking about phase one, and to move into full capacity normal mode, there's a
Uh-huh.
lot of question of like how about the social distancing in
Right.
businesses and restaurants, and how are we being able to equip the small businesses, which can
Uh-huh.
take quite an expense to these adjustments? How are we enabling them to keep their business and also be able to take on protective equipment?
Right.
How are we going to do sports?
Uh-huh.
And
Right.
how are we going to do sports? My good friend Matthew Ritchie wrote a fantastic article of why the U.S. is not ready for sports. Highly recommend you to reach out to him. Highly
Uh-huh.
recommend anybody to look up this article. It is a
Yeah.
very, very well, thoroughly written article about
You know how
we want
South Korea is
we
doing
want to get into
sports?
sports. We need to talk about all these other things that we need to do because sports has a high audience capacity, huge amount of activity going on, and that means also huge amounts of testing and protective equipment, and also at some point a vaccination needs to be of great interest and presence in this conversation too. So
Right.
that's what I'm
It's not
saying.
available now, but it may
Mhm.
be in the future. But you're
Yeah,
right. Have you heard of how South Korea is doing its sports now?
I have not heard. Tell me about that. How has South Korea been doing this?
So baseball is huge in South Korea, and
Yeah.
so we shut it down for like a few months, like probably 2 months, and then now it's back again. Except audience members are not allowed to come into the stadium, so
Mhm.
they watch from home. There's like a paper like audience members in the stadium, and then people still do the baseball game match itself, and then they take obviously precautions and things like that. So fun
Wonderful.
thing.
That is so
Yeah.
fantastic to hear about.
Yeah.
Yeah, but back to the question you said at hand. That is some of the reasons why I say that we need to uphold the assumption of a stay-at-home needed, because we're not at the capacity of South Korea, at that level of capacity of functioning yet, um, and not every place has the affordability to get to that functioning yet. So
Sure.
that's why
Talking
I make.
about affordability, I mean, this is another assumption that we'll try to look at.
Wait,
Yes.
to answer your thing about economics saying like,
Uh-huh.
oh, maybe we don't have to pump a bunch of money. Um,
Yes.
I think
Wait, how about we talk about the economics uh in the next episode?
I
Uh,
don't care.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we could talk about it in the next episode. But
But how
which
about the question? The question itself you were saying about easing measures. How about that one?
the affordability of easing measures,
Right,
or like
right.
so? Okay, so it's interesting because so I have been hearing a lot of cool things about areas you don't think about:
Okay.
nonprofit,
Uh-huh.
soup kitchen, dog cat grooming areas, K through
Grooming areas? Okay.
yeah, K through 12 public education,
Uh-huh.
and low-income housing.
Right.
These are some, but not, this is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of other places, but these are some of the places I've heard that I feel like has not been given attention to when we talk about providing distribution of protective equipment, testing, all those type of phase uh, measures that we need to want to do. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think affordability is a big thing because if you are a nonprofit and you have a very limited budget to work with, and you are already working per se to okay, let's take the example of, suppose you're a nonprofit that is working on reducing drug overdosing,
Yeah.
and your nonprofit focuses on educating about opioid overdose. You're educating populations about drug overdosing and drug treatment, and you're also on the end about advocacy about we need to open very safe needle exchange sites. We need to open and talk about creating healthcare that's more affordable for these populations that may not have easy access to get treatment for these very expensive drug treatments and such. So that's like that itself, that is something that is still present in a pandemic. It might even be exaggerated during a pandemic because stress and drug abuse can happen still, and that itself has a constrained budget as a nonprofit. But then you add this complexity of how are we going to educate people about um, drug overdosing or needle exchange or opioid use and the dangers of it, and have these conversations in person if we suddenly have to be concerned about the surfaces, the needles that touch, where people have gone, and how do we communicate with people, and how do we um, talk to people without like endangering them further from a coronavirus. And that could require protective equipment. That would probably require some like testing measures. That would also require, if you are a nonprofit that is transporting to different places and different neighborhoods to talk about these things and create workshops, then you have to bring all those extra protective equipment and stuff to reach these populations and neighborhoods that otherwise have not been reached out before. And so that's why I see that it, to some groups like nonprofit, it can be expensive, and if they are left out in the discussion phases of how we're going to go through the phases of reopening things, and maybe per se Macy's has it way easier of opening and going through the phases compared to a small nonprofit that is a very limited budget and has to reach very sparsed out populations in the area.
Right, right. So
Yeah.
it's those are actions that can help the less privileged, as you may like think, go through this pandemic. You're saying, and that's interesting. And so like it's interesting to see like the differences. Like we've touched on the fact that people who are against these social, I guess, distancing measures and stay-at-home orders tend to have white privilege, right? But we also realize that on the other side, people who are implementing stay-at-home orders, those people may also have some privilege in saying that people who cannot actually afford it are expected to do so without
Yeah.
any kind of sustainability of being able to pay for their rent, pay for their food and things like that, transportation. So that's also an interesting thing to think about.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, so I was actually talking with like call service people
Yeah.
and you're probably already embedded in the community, but like a lot of people who work at essential services,
Mhm.
right? They have to actually work. Like they have no other option, right?
Yeah.
At Target, Walmart, things like that, or health services, like they
Mhm.
are more at risk even with stay-at-home orders, right?
Yes.
So that's also another aspect that is not even part of the I like discussions about stay-at-home orders, right? What how do these people work?
That is totally true, and that itself is like another phenomena of its own, because you are you're given, it's so interesting because essential workers are doing a very daring task, a very bold, courageous task. They're putting their life on the line to
Hmm.
be there for other people, whether it be customer service and really helping people get the goods and services that they need, or it's also saving people's lives at the front line of this battle against COVID-19. And in all of this, there's the sacrifices they make for themselves, and also the risk that they take for themselves, but also also the sacrifices they have to make to their lifestyle, that maybe they're not being able to stay home with their loved ones and their family because they want to keep them protected, and they might live somewhere else, or they might live in an isolated part of the house and not be able to hug their children or really spend time with any other loved ones too. And as courageous and bold as this is, then you have this whole thing about, we need to thank our essential workers. We need to thank our essential workers. I totally agree. We need to give a huge thank you for them. But I don't think it's enough just to say, applaud, applaud, thank you so much. Because clearly these are people who are also very, like, largely overworked. I am concerned about the ethics of their overworked of itself as an aspiring bioethicist, as a minor in bioethics. It's a whole conversation of the ethics of essential workers and their working conditions. Actually, yeah, let me talk about that. So one aspect I'll look into is the essential workers in the food industry. Okay. My final paper for food ethics, I think I'm gonna clean it up and blog about it soon. So be on the
Uh-huh.
lookout for that. Is looking about how the ethics of the working conditions and of these essential workers who produce and pack and distribute food. And these are people who are not necessarily paid great. They could probably be paid low wage, not many short breaks, and may or may not have protective equipment.
Hmm.
And if they are an undocumented individual or a very vulnerable population, they might not be respected very well in the work. They may not be given any of these um, equal equitable access to protective equipment or other standards that keeps them safe. And so
Right.
you're working this person to the bone, and clearly the paycheck may not be enough, but they're doing work that in a sense they feel obligated to do by financial obligations, and also in the sense of the obligation of I need to do this because people count on me. But then they themselves are not being well compensated for their time. They may not have hazardous pay, even though they're working plenty of hours and are endangering themselves. And
Right.
they may not be getting the representation they need to talk about these things because they are a population that's being exploited for their work, but they're not getting that representation and that bargaining ability to ask for more that they need. Does that make
Right. I
sense?
mean, one could even argue, these stay-at-home orders actually puts these vulnerable populations at risk. I mean,
Mm.
it's almost a white privilege in and of itself, if not a high income level privilege, where
Yes.
people who can afford to just not work for 4 months are only people who have high incomes, right? And so even people who are not in essential services, they are actually forced to work in these services. So you see a phenomenon of people who used to work in different areas, now they're
Yes.
forced to work in lower income
Mhm.
jobs just to be able to meet their income. And
Yeah.
also people already working at these essential work, like commercial sites, being worked to the bone, as you mentioned. So like they're working more, they're more at risk. And so one could argue, these stay-at-home measures that mostly Black people and minorities and people are arguing on the behest of progressive people, they might actually be doing this at the cost of their own interests. So another
It's a
thing interesting to think about.
it is complex. You are
Yeah.
definitely right. And I think it's really complex because the philosophical question at hand is how are we preserving the individual's dignity and well-being? Because dignity and well-being are much more harder to measure than just health. Like health of itself, like physical health, you take a thermometer temperature, you do some tests, and then you're able to assess from a certain amount of standards whether someone is healthy or not healthy. But when you look at these very equally important but also complex things of a human being is the dignity and well-being. And dignity and well-being is always at the core of the conversations of ethics of ethics of food production, or the ethics of death and dying, or the ethics of childcare, or the ethics of education. And at any of these type of ethical conversations, it is at the core of dignity and well-being. And that's why it makes it so complicated, because as we have been discussing, that sometimes these measures can be really good at preserving the dignity and well-being, but can be
Mhm.
at a cost depending on a person's background or privilege or income level. And other
Right.
times the dignity and well-being can be jeopardized from the lack of the measures involved. And it just goes to show like that it just goes I think it really goes to show that dignity and well-being are not very standardized as compared to health. Like you can't say like, oh, everybody agrees that X, Y, and Z should be what is representative of someone's dignity. It's not necessarily true, because there's a lot of other factors that go behind someone's dignity and well-being, which can be the cultural background, the religious beliefs, the moral values involved, and the things that someone cares about in their life that is a reflection of what they've done all of their life. Because as you've mentioned, there are people who are laid off at a job, but they need a job to take care of their family of 4, 5, 6, or 7 or so, and
Right.
suddenly they're working in a lower income situation that is both working them to the bone, may or may not have hazardous pay, may or may not have adequate protective equipment, and suddenly someone's dignity and well-being is being fluctuating, and it's like also in jeopardy. And in some sense their well-being is preserved in the sense I have a job and I can give some financial security to my family and loved ones, and another
Right.
sense the well-being of I can't pursue the passions that I initially planned for in my life. And I don't
Right.
know if I can return to them anytime soon.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of these are very interesting topics, especially the economics, which we will probably talk about in the next episode of
And
what's up with Jessup.
I will probably have to do another episode another time because
Sure.
I'm getting sleepy.
Exactly. And it's pretty late there at night, Smitha.
Yes.
It's yeah. So thank you very much for being on the podcast, Smitha. Yes. Do you have any other plugs, where can people find you? I know we did this in the previous podcast, but people have to be reminded.
Yes, of course. I am here to remind the lovely listeners once again that my name is Smitha Mahesh, and I am a co-producer for the Professionals in Health podcasting series. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And if you love listening about the various people in the health sector, from mental health to medical art to public health to
All
food,
kinds of
then
stuff on health.
anything under the umbrella of health, give it a check it out.
Mhm.
And if you want to check out our updates on our podcast, give us a follow for our episodes at pips_jh. And if you want to listen more about me and my life, then you could give me a follow on my Twitter at _SMITHAMAHESH_.
That sounds good.
Yeah, thank
And
you so much, Jessup.
of course, of course. Please make sure to leave a review for this podcast as well. Have you subscribed, Smitha?
Yes, I have subscribed. I do keep
Nice.
up with the updates. Thanks.
Very good. So, you can be subscribed to this. Please make sure to check out Smitha and all the wonderful podcasts she is doing there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.